G'day ladies and gents, and welcome to War Thunder with Mags, and welcome back to the patch 1.51 Dev Server 2. Today we're going to be doing an overview of the armour of the three new top-end tanks for the US, German and Russian forces. Now, there were several changes to the armour of these tanks between the first and second development servers, most notably the T10's lower plate. I'll do my best to cover all aspects of the armour of these vehicles as they currently stand as of development server 2. To those who have more interest in the aircraft, I would have loved to have shown you the details of the new aircraft in patch 1.51. However, as of Dev Server 2, most of the new aircraft seem to be incomplete, with placeholder flight models and unfinished module tech trees. So, first up, let's take a look at the 105mm Gun Tank M60. Now, the M60 is, of course, Era 5, battle rating 7.7, and we'll start by taking a look at the frontal armour of the turret. This armour is 178mm thick, with an armour sloping of 18 degrees. As the armour curves, it ranges between 230 and 240mm thick depending on angle, and wraps underneath the gun mantlet, providing a double layer of armour around the outside of the mantlet for approximately 1/4 of its coverage. Turret side armour is 127mm thick with an angle of 23 degrees. This gives it an effective frontal thickness of 199mm. Mantlet thickness is 114.3mm with an angle of 25 degrees, giving the mantlet an effective thickness of between 122 and 126mm due to its non-uniform design. This mantlet armour combined with the front turret armour gives the front of the M60 a combined 360mm of armour around the outer edges of the gun mantlet. The turret ring of the M60 is also armoured at 178mm at 30 degrees with an effective thickness of 224mm from every angle. The upper glacis of the M60 is 93mm thick, but is sloped back at 65 degrees, giving it an effective thickness of 183mm. This may seem thin, however it is worth noting that the 65 degree back angle is past the minimum penetration reduction angle and is in fact so severe that most shells will bounce without ever having a chance to penetrate. Changing the angle of the upper plate to 45 degrees off centre raises the effective thickness to 210mm. At this angle, with the 65 degree back slope, the upper glacis of the M60 cannot be penetrated by any shell currently available in War Thunder, including the new Heat FS round. The lower glacis of the M60 mirrors the numbers of the upper glacis at this time. The side armour is only 74mm thick, with a back angle of 5 degrees, however effective thickness while angled at 45 degrees is 200mm. The large track layout on the M60 also acts as spaced armour to high explosive heat and HESH rounds, adding some protection. However, APCR and APDS should have no problems penetrating this side armour at hull angles at less than 30 degrees offside. The side armour of the M60's turret is predictably thin, with only 76.2mm at an angle of only 12 degrees. This gives an effective thickness of between 80 and 90mm due to curvature of the armour. The rear armour of the hull is only around 54mm effective, with 76mm completing the armour at the rear of the turret. Overall, the armour of the M60 is relatively light for a 7.7 battle rating tank, however it can be angled effectively at 45 degrees. It is worth noting, however, that the M60 does feature a major weak spot at all angles that unfortunately I failed to record in this video. The commander's cupola is only around 50mm thick and is tall enough to be struck from all angles around the tank. Striking the cupola with high explosive or a HESH round will likely kill all crew in the turret of the vehicle, eliminating the need to deal with the M60's frontal or angled armour at all. The internal module layout of the tank is extremely compact, as would be expected for such a small machine. However, it is worth noting that the ammunition racks for the M60 are all placed on the left-hand side of the vehicle. In a situation where you find yourself needing to angle against an enemy attack, I would recommend angling the tank to keep the enemy to your right-hand side at 45 degrees. This will place most of the ammunition racks on the far side of the tank, decreasing the chance of impact and rack detonation. The ammunition for the M60 consists of an armour-piercing discarding sabot shell, a HESH round, and a high-explosive anti-tank fin-stabilised round. These three ammunition types, while carrying different names, are exactly the same across the M60, the Leopard I, and the T10, with all identical penetration values on each shell type. It is worth noting, however, that the HESH round is currently not working as it should at this time, and it is unknown whether or not the HESH shell will be corrected before the patch goes live. One thing that will be very important to keep in mind during the rest of this armour review, however, is the performance of the high explosive anti-tank fin stabilised shell, the M456 round for the M60. This fin-stabilised heat round performs exactly the same for all three tanks, and is worth noting the degradation of performance over angle. While all the tanks feature 400mm penetration at 0 degrees over all ranges, this reduces down to 346mm at 30 degrees and 199mm at 60 degrees. At angles beyond 60 degrees, like with most shells, it's highly likely the shell will simply ricochet. Next up we have the Leopard I. After testing this tank's mobility in my last video, as well as gun performance with stock ammo, it's time to find out how high its survivability is when faced with incoming fire. Unfortunately, the numbers on the Leopard I are worse than that on the M60. Upper plate thickness is only 70mm with a back slope of 61 degrees, giving an effective thickness of 121mm from the front. The lower plate is only 50mm at 51 degrees with an effective armour thickness of 96.1mm. While the overall armour thickness is low, the high angle should generate bounces against most shells. The mantlet of the Leopard is interesting as it is broken into 5 pieces. The lower left hand side is 200mm thick and angles at 12 degrees for an effective thickness of 228mm. The upper half of the mantlet and the lower right hand side is only 100mm thick and is perfectly flat with no angle applied despite the appearance of a back slope. The bottom of the mantlet consists of a small 30mm thick plate angled at 37 degrees for an effective thickness of 67.6mm, with the top of the mantlet featuring another small plate at 50mm thick but this time angled at 46 degrees for an effective thickness of 70mm. The turret side and rear armour is 60mm angled at 17 degrees. This gives the Leopard I an effective 95mm of armour on the turret cheeks. The turret sides come in at 60mm at 27 degrees with an effective of 64mm of armour, with both the upper and lower armour behind the Leopard's tracks having a thickness of only 45mm at 40 degrees of angle. Rear armour on the Leopard I is only 35mm thick with an angle of 12 degrees back sloped, giving an effective thickness of around 36mm. The internal module layout of the Leopard I is best described as horrifying. The entire tank is either ammo racks or fuel tanks with this large block of shells directly at the front behind that poor front armour. And once again, just quickly looking over the shell availability in the Leopard I, we have one APDS round, one HESH round, and one high explosive anti-tank fin stabilised. All have identical performance to the shells that were mentioned earlier on with the M60. So that's the armour of the Leopard I. From the front it's possible that it may be able to bounce most of the shots aimed at its hull due to angle, however with that upper mantlet only being 100mm thick with no angle, there is no way this tank can afford to take incoming fire from any vehicle it will face in combat. In regards to the mantlet, it's also worth noting that unlike the outer edge of the M60's mantlet, the front turret armour does not wrap underneath the Leopard's mantlet. 100mm is all it has. So next up we come to the Russian T10, also known as the IS-8. The T10 has had several armour changes since the first dev server, most notably in the lower glacis. After the release of the first dev server, there were a number of videos showing the T10's lower plate being an easy to pen weak point in its armour, as at the time this armour was only angled at 33 degrees. At this time on dev server 2, the armour angle of the lower plate has been increased to 50 degrees with an armour thickness of 120mm, giving an effective thickness of 238mm. It's worth remembering that the Heat FS shell, currently one of the highest penetration shells in the game, only has 220mm of penetration at 50 degrees. While the lower plate still represents the weakest point in the T10's front armour, it is no longer a weak point providing the T10 driver faces the opponent on level ground. The upper glacis spade is also 120mm thick but is angled back at 54 degrees with a slight side angle giving it an effective armour of 239mm. The angles on both the upper and lower plates are likely to cause most shells to simply bounce before they have a chance to penetrate, however. The front turret armour is 250mm thick and back angles and curves at 44 degrees, giving an armour thickness in excess of 500mm, so high that it can't be displayed. The turret cheeks are 150mm thick and angled back and curved at 45 degrees, giving an effective armour level of 499mm from the front. The visible section of the top of the turret is only 30mm thick, however it is angled from the front at over 70 degrees. This is an auto ricochet to all shells in the game. Effective armour thickness is 133mm. The T10 Side Armor comes in 2 layers. The outer layer is only 120mm thick with 43 degrees of slope, giving it an effective armour level of 150mm. The inner layer is only 80mm thick, however it is backsloped at 62 degrees, giving it an effective armour thickness of 171mm. This armour is also covered by the tracks, which as with all tanks will prevent HE, heat and HESH detonation. This armour can also be angled out to 272mm at 45 degrees and up to over 400mm at 30 degrees off centre. The rear upper plate is 50mm with an angle of 57 degrees, giving an effective thickness of around 85mm, which is not too bad for rear armour. The lower rear plate is 60mm thick at 12 degrees with an effective thickness of around 64.2mm, so this is probably the weakest point in the T10's armour. And last but not least, the rear turret armour of the T10 at 80mm thick with a sloping of 36 degrees, giving it an effective thickness of 102mm. Now the shell layout is slightly different with the T10 from the Leopard I and the T60, with the T10 featuring a standard shell of APCBC and then unlocking an APDS round and a high explosive anti-tank fin stabilized round, as well as having a standard shell availability of high explosive. Now while the shell penetrations on the APDS round and the Heat FS round are virtually identical to those in the Leopard I and in the M60, it's worth noting that the shell velocities on these shells are slightly lower by about 100 meters per second, but the overall mass of the shell is significantly heavier, with the Leopard I's APDS round only being about 5.5 kilos, the T10's comes in at 7.5. Same story with the Heat FS round, coming in at 11 kilos on the Leopard I, but coming in at 18 kilos on the T10. How this weight difference will affect shell performance, I'm not entirely sure at this time. So ladies and gentlemen, that is the armour layouts of the M60, the Leopard I and the T10M, the three new top-end tanks that will be added to War Thunder in patch 1.51. Hope you enjoyed the video. Click like if you do, subscribe if you want to see more. Fly smart, fly safe, and I'll catch you in the skies.